to be going over some Dart concepts, so just the fundamentals of using the language. And then I'll be talking about the Flutter framework, basically how Flutter lays out widgets, the Flutter widget tree. And then after that, a good chunk of time will be spent into exposing y'all to like UI design principles, so that you can apply these to either mobile UI designs or web designs. And then I'll be showcasing a prototype for a to-do app that will be implemented in part 2. So that's kind of how part 1 is going to go. Part 2 will be more code, definitely, but this one's kind of not so much code, just kind of throwing you into Dart and Flutter. So let's get started. First thing is Dart, right? So pretty much, I'll go over some data types, variables, and operators. So data types, these are your basic data types from like, if you've taken CS1, CS2, very similar to like C++. We have integers, doubles, strings, booleans, lists. We also have maps, dictionaries, right? For the variables, I have an example here. And to start us off, I guess I can go ahead and say that Dart is basically a dynamic and statically typed language. So in this first example, we have a variable x instantiated with type dynamic. And this basically means that this variable can be instantiated with, for example, an integer value, and then we can reassign that to a string or a double, whatever we want, right? And then like, to continue talking about the example, we can have regular static typed variables, right? So double A equal to 5.1, string str equal to string that says Dart, a Boolean variable test equals to false. The only weird one that we got to look out for is list and maps, because these variables need to be instantiated with arrows around the data type that we're making a list of. So in this case, we're making a list of integers. If you wanted to make a list of doubles, well, you would put double in there, string. And map is a similar way, but I didn't put it here. So yeah, that's a little bit about variables. Operators, these are very similar to ones you might have used in other languages. The only notable one to mention is integer division, because it takes the tilde and then slash for integer division. All the other ones, though, you should be familiar with, right? Subtraction, addition, multiplication, division. The only weird one that looks weird here is equality, because the slide template was like formatting it weird, but you'll see in the next slide that it's just the same as in C++. You would put these two equal signs next to each other. So let me show you a little bit about conditionals. Here's one example using a variable of type double initialized to 2.5. And if we wanted to write if-else statements, we can say if x is equal to 2, well, it would do something in this bracket. So if it was equal to 2, it would print I'm 2, but it's not, so it won't go in here. If it's less than 2, then it'll print something like I'm a 1, else it'll print maybe a 3. In this case, it would fall into the else statement, right? Because it doesn't fit any other cases. But some key details to take note of here is that it's a very similar structure to C++. We have the if, the expression surrounded with parentheses and then braces. Another thing to mention is that this Dart code can run in its own main function pretty much. So this code right now is running in a website called Dartpad. You can just Google it and it'll be like a little workspace for Dart, and it's great just for experimenting. And another thing to note is that these print statements are very similar to Python. So when learning Dart, I think it's kind of helpful to think of this language as a mixture of C++ and Python, kind of, because we have some C++ elements and some Python elements. So now let me show you a little about loops. And this will become a little more apparent, like this Python C++ overlap, because in this top left example, we can have a list of strings that'll iterate over these 3 different elements. Flutter is great. And the for loop, will iterate. We can create a I counter, kind of like we do in C++. And for as long as this I counter is less than the length of the string list, we'll keep incrementing the counter, and we'll just go printing each element. And it'll end up with the console output on the right. But you could also write this for loop in Python style, because if you ever use Python, then you know that it's like in Python, you could do something like for num in nums. So for an element in this list. It's very similar here. The only difference is that you do have to declare the type of the element. So it'd be for string s and str, right? And yeah, this results in the exact same output pretty much. So you could execute either of these and you'd get the same thing. But yeah, other than that, the last thing I want to mention, just real brief, is functions. Again, very similar to C++. If we take a look at the main function, we can print out the string, the cat went, and then quotations. And actually, this is a good example of a string interpolation. If you're not familiar with string interpolation, basically it's like injecting a piece of a string with a piece of code. So in this case, we're using the $Bracey notation, and we can put any kind of dark code in here, and it'll get converted into a string type once it's finished executing. So in this case, we're calling meow, a function meow, and this function will just return a string that says meow. That's pretty much it for that like example. But for the other function is odd, we're basically sending it an integer value, and we're just doing modulus 2. And if this operation is not equal to 0, then we return a true, because that would mean it's an odd number. If it's equal to 0, then that means it's even. So in the main function, we're passing a 5, so it should be true. And we're also passing a 222, so that should be false. And just one last thing to mention here. Typically, this is odd function might look a little weird, because typically you might do like if, and then this operation return true or false, or else false. You might want to, I mean, that's something you might do, but something you can do in Dart is just return the actual expression. So you could do like number modulus 2 not equal to 0, and whatever that expression results in, you'll get that value returned out of the function. So real basic, and these functions actually don't have to be above the main function, they could be anywhere. So yeah, it's a little bit about functions, and that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about Dart. I do have some resources listed after the Flutter section with links that can teach you a little bit more about Dart, and I really recommend looking at those if you are still interested in mobile dev after this. So now let me talk about the Flutter architecture. This is going to be more about how Flutter handles widgets, how it like lays things out on the screen and stuff like that, so you kind of have a better idea of what you're working with for part 2. So what is Flutter? Flutter is basically a cross-platform development framework. So Dart was the language, Flutter is the framework, and this framework was made by Google. And basically, you can use this to make software applications. So you can make, if you wanted to make an app for both iOS and Android, you wouldn't need to do that in 2 different code bases with Flutter. You'd be able to do it in 1. And more recently, actually, you can also develop for desktop and web. So that's great. So why would you want to use Flutter? Well, again, 1 code base. If you think about it, if you wanted to make initially just an iOS application, then you would make it in Swift. But later on down the line, let's say it gets successful and you want to move on to Android users as well, you're going to have to make a Kotlin/Java code base. So you at that point, you have 2 different code bases, and now you have to allocate different resources for 2 different teams, and it might get costly in the end. So that's maybe one reason you might want to use Flutter. Another reason is it's a simple way of laying out user interfaces, and this will become a little clearer in the next slide because I have like an illustration, but basically Flutter allows you to make custom widgets. So it's very modular in that you can like create like a button widget, for example, customize it and customize it over and over again until you're satisfied with it. And then you can pretty much not like actually encode, but you can like drag and drop these widgets onto your screen how you want them, right, in code. So there's that. Another great thing is hot reload. So hot reloads, basically, you can be coding up your application, have your emulator on the side so you can see your changes. And every time you Control S or save all your files, it'll update automatically on the right side. No need to like completely restart the application. There are cases where you do have to actually. You might have, like when you're importing fonts or adding maybe new files, you might want to restart just so that it completely resets the app. But most of the time when you're just developing, you can just Control S and it'll update. And this is great because it's basically like drawing, like you're basically drawing onto like a painting, for example. And the last thing is that Flutter is open source. So if you don't like something about Flutter, or you just want to see like how they implement something that's already in the code base, you can go to GitHub, find the Flutter SDK and fork it over, mess around with it, right? So that's always good. I don't think other technologies like maybe Swift or Kotlin, I'm not sure if they're open source, but Flutter is open source, so that's great. But yeah, this is kind of the Flutter app structure. So I like to think of it in like a tree kind of style, like here on the left. You can think about like, if you take a look at your mobile application screen, like just one screen, this screen would be comprised of something called a scaffold in Flutter. And this scaffold might hold many different things. So it might hold an app bar. It might hold a container, like, oh, sorry, let me mention what an app bar is. An app bar is the top portion of the application where you have like your back button and maybe some icons, maybe a title for that screen. So you might want to have an app bar, and like maybe under that app bar, you might want to have like text, maybe you want to have cards, many different things, right? So in that case, you would want to give this scaffold a body, maybe a container, and this container will hold a column of many different widgets. Maybe you could have row, maybe an icon widget, text widgets, many different things that can, like this kind of tree keeps growing as you enter your application, right? And on the right side, you can see an example of this. It's not completely filled out the code, but this is kind of like what it would look like. You'd have like a scaffold object, and within that you would pass in different parameters. So you could have an app bar parameter, you could have a body parameter, and this body would take in a container that would maybe have a child of column, and this column might take a list of widgets as its children, and you could put rows, icons, text. So yeah, that's pretty much like how you're going to be messing with Flutter when you start actually coding. I just wanted to include this like image of a tree because that's kind of how I think about it when you're developing, and it's kind of helpful to know. But we'll definitely keep talking about this in part 2 when I have the to-do application implemented. So, okay, and this is the resources I mentioned earlier. So over the spring break, if you're interested in like maybe messing with that to-do application after part 2, then you might want to install Flutter. It's not super lengthy, but there are a couple of steps that I didn't want to include in the workshop just to save time. But over the spring break, maybe if you're interested, you can go ahead and follow this article. Or if you don't want to read, you can also watch this YouTube walkthrough doing the same thing. You only have to do it once. If you want to upgrade it, you just do like Flutter upgrade, and that's it. For learning resources, I really recommend Learn Dart in Y Minutes. You might have heard this website if you've had to learn like a programming language real quick, like in a matter of time. They also have an article for Dart, and basically goes really in depth, like way more in depth than I did right now in the last section. So that's worth skimming over if you're interested. Another thing you can look into is Flutter Udemy. This course is by Angela Yu, and this is something I bought like 2 years ago when it was on sale. It was only like 10, 15 bucks. So, and it's just a bunch of video tutorials. So if you're interested in that too, definitely look out for a sale on Udemy and buy that course. It's awesome. And then just last resource is Flutter Gallery. This is a website I found recently. Basically, if you're not familiar with Google's material UI components, basically Google made like a set of UI like icons and fonts and many different things, components. And what Flutter Gallery does is it like lists all these things out on that website so you can interact with them and access the source code and change certain things about them, and you'll see it in real time. So that's a great website too. I personally haven't used it much, but it's definitely good to look at, like experiment with on there. So, and I'll be putting these slides in the Discord channel after this, so you'll have all this. But yeah, for the third section, let me start talking a little bit about design principles, what you should consider when you're creating your own mobile UI designs. And these things, like, I just kind of want to expose these things to y'all because it's not really something that's like taught in the curriculum, I don't think. And you can really apply these to either mobile or web. It doesn't have to be just mobile. So here's just 6 of them that I kind of want to tell you about. I'll kind of highlight color and contrast, typography, and visual hierarchy, because those are, in my opinion, like the more important ones. But they're all really important, and you all should, if you're still interested in UI design, you can definitely keep looking into these, right? So let's start with color contrast and typography. These 2, I think, are very important because they both kind of contribute to like the emotion or vibe that you want to give in your application, right? If you're thinking of, like, for example, news article websites, the fonts they tend to use are serif fonts, and serif fonts are like the ones with like the little ticks or like the flags on the letters, right, that make them look more formal. The reason they do this is because they want to come off as more professional, right? Or maybe just any kind of website that uses serif fonts, they just want to go for a professional look. And same thing goes for color and contrast, right? If you want to go for like a professional look, you might want to use like a navy blue or like some darker colors. So those 2, I really want to highlight those because when you're designing, those 2 things should be like something you define right off the bat so that you can like basically confine your scope. You won't spend too much time experimenting with like this hue of color or this font over this font. Like if you just define that stuff before you start designing, it'll save you a lot of time. In terms of visual hierarchy is pretty much the order of these design elements. And this is everywhere. It doesn't even have to be in mobile, but I'll give you a mobile application example. If you open an application, like literally any, you might be greeted with like a welcome text, and then you might be greeted with like your profile icon at the top right. Maybe you'll be given like a summary of some sort, maybe a text summary or a card summary, and then you might have like a horizontal sliding icons or cards, So basically the point of visual hierarchy is like, so you emphasize the experience that your user is going through when they're going through your application. And this could be with anything. You could even apply it to like T labels. T labels, like for example, Tivana. I've seen T labels where they'll like list out the Tivana logo, and then under that it'll be like, for example, like peach tranquility, and then under that, like that's the flavor, and then under that it'll be like soothing peach for, I don't know, nighttime. And basically the goal is to like read them in that order. And color and typography also play a role in this, right? If you have like a gradient from like yellow to pink, that's kind of like also kind of contributing to the user experience. So visual hierarchy is also really important. It's a lot to go into that, and I'll talk about that more. But the other 3, complexity and simplicity, this basically involves like, for example, too many gradients might pop out to the user, like color gradients. Maybe too many drop shadows on your cards is too much. Like, I guess the main point I want to say is that less is more. You don't want to over design. Consistency, you should definitely keep design attributes consistent, right? You don't want to like, you want to keep, like, for example, spacing between cards the same. You want to keep the same fonts, the same colors. You don't want to change hues too often unless you like really have a reason to. And then last thing, white space. When you're designing, I've noticed that a large amount of like new, like upcoming designers or whatever, like people tend to like, let's say they're designing a card. People tend to try and fit like tons of information in this tiny little card, when it's a lot better to have like a huge amount of white space, structure everything you want in there. And once you have it looking okay, then you can kind of downsize your white space. And that ends up looking a lot better than if you start with like a smaller like surface area of card or whatever you're designing, right? So all these kind of are really important when you're starting to design. And now I guess I'll show you some examples of like mediocre designs and someone improving them. These aren't my designs, but I found them on YouTube from a YouTube channel called Design Course. And yeah, so the left one is the old one. The right one is the improved one. So if we take a look at the left one, we have like, hey there, I'm Callum, and I'm not your average software engineer. This is like a portfolio design. So just right, like starting off, like I don't really like the typography. It's kind of a little too fun, like too friendly for a portfolio anyway. And then we have like CV projects. These are call to action buttons. And right now they're styled in a way that the user's not really clear which one to go through first. They don't know which one to click first. And then we have this illustration, which is completely fine, but I think it's kind of located in a weird spot. Like it should be like different, because if you scale this application, like if you increase the width, it might not scale like correctly. It might look weird. And then we have an about section with the same fonts. And this is also something that you should look at, because you don't want to have like the same heading font in your same body as the body text, right? The body font. So that's the left one. And what the right one does is pretty much, it kind of simplifies the headline to just, I'm Callum, I'm not your average software engineer, and really emphasizes that like tagline. And from there, they kind of emphasize the projects, right? Because when you're looking at a portfolio, you want to go to the projects right away, look at what they have to offer, and then you might go see the CV. So it's really emphasizing and de-emphasizing, right? You don't want to confuse your user. Visual hierarchy, right? You want the user experience to be as smooth as possible. And then we move like the illustration. That'll look good when you stretch out the screen, right? It might grow the illustration, look better. The about section is really simple too. We kind of watermark it in the background, and then we just list it out real simple and professional. And so that's kind of all the changes that he does, and that's like already instantly better. And like this just overall looks cleaner than the original. And that's all just from applying those UI fundamentals I mentioned. So now the second example is very similar. It's a portfolio, and pretty much it looks very similar, like the improvements, I mean. So here on the left, we have two different headlines that kind of compete with each other. That's another thing I was going to mention. You don't want to have design elements that compete. So here we have need beautiful experiences and designs. I've got you covered. These two shouldn't compete, right? It looks kind of weird that they're like the same size, the same font. And that's something you should look out for. The illustration is okay, but it might be a little weak. And the call to action buttons are all styled similarly. So you might want to like emphasize which one you want to, which one you want your user to click first. Right now it's unclear there. So in the right design, what we do is we emphasize the headline, we de-emphasize the like the sub like headline or sub tagline. Again, we emphasize my work over just hire me, or hire me is now like a line text button. Again, user experience, like the visual hierarchy is going from top to bottom. The illustration also looks a little better. It kind of gives off a different like mood, maybe not so much like it's kind of like subjective there with the illustration, but overall it still looks clean. And the about section is similar thing. The only difference here is that instead of making it like a separate link when you click this button, like now it's just listed under that, right? So, and there's like tons of white space. The typography is good. It looks professional, right? So yeah, a lot of the things that I said in the last one kind of apply here too, right? And that's, again, just using fundamentals of UI design. So yeah, that's just two examples. I really recommend though, like, let me talk about these resources. I really recommend looking at websites like Dribbble, Behance. These two are websites that just, a lot of designers post their designs on there, and it's great for you to look through them and kind of solidify your style and design. Just kind of exposing yourself to different things and seeing what you like, what you don't like. Mobbin is a website where they kind of compile popular applications, popular mobile applications into that website, and you can like filter. So you can say, oh, let me see what Facebook does on their login screen, and then it'll show you that. Or if you want to see like lists, or maybe sign up screens or login screens, like there's many different things on that website. It's great. So those three websites I really recommend. I have a recommended book. Maybe not everyone likes to read, but this book is Refactoring UI. The good thing though is that it's not very wordy. By that I mean like it basically gives you tons of examples with like very concise text descriptions on why those examples look good and why they don't, or why some might look good over another, right? So I really recommend that book. It's not too expensive, I don't think. And finally, some YouTube channels. So these are two great YouTube channels I've seen. Jesse Showalter does a lot of live stream design. So like he'll live stream and design something from completely just completely scratch, right? And it's kind of good to see this because you see like the thought process that goes into like why you would place something here or design something like that or whatever, right? So that's a great channel that I watched a lot when I was starting. Design course. I recently found out about this one, but it's also good. They have a lot of UI design crash courses that they do yearly. And that one actually touches on all those UI fundamentals like individually and goes way more in depth than I did. And the revamping 3 mobile designs are those examples I showed. And he does those a lot. So like, I really recommend all this stuff if you're still interested in UI design. But yeah, I think next is just showing you all the prototype for the for what's going to be implemented in part 2. So this section, I'll kind of just go over like my process of designing, like how I go about it. And I've already kind of hinted at it, but first thing you want to do is kind of confine the scope. So you want to figure out like, okay, what typography do I want to use? You want to choose a heading, subheading, and paragraph font. Usually 3 fonts is fine. And really you could use the same font for heading and subheading, just with different font sizes. When you're choosing these fonts, you might also want to consider like serif and sans serif. Like I mentioned earlier, serif is the one with the little like flags, formal looking. Sans serif are the more modern ones. And I'll show you some sans serif ones right now. And then you also want to choose a color palette, just again, so you can confine the scope. You should find a primary, secondary, and off-white color. And you might also want to choose like a completely flat white color, maybe a very dark gray for your text. And also do note that you don't need to use every color. Like I've noticed in my previous designs, like I'll make like 5, 6 colors, but then I really only use 2 or 3. So yeah, you don't have to like go overboard with these colors, right? And then last thing, I just wanted to mention this. I do it sometimes, but another thing you can do in the case that you can't visually, like you can't envision what you're going to design, it's also a good exercise to just draw it out on paper, because in the end, like you could just draw something and if you don't like it, you can just rip it out, throw it away, right? And you save time from like doing it on Figma and like doing all the technical stuff and wasting some time. It's a lot faster to just draw it out on paper. And it like sometimes it really does help because sometimes I can't envision something in my head. So after drawing it, it really helps. And then like the good thing of that is like once you figure something out that you really want to design, you can just put it on the side and be like, okay, like on Figma, you just go and say, okay, let me make a rectangle here. This will be my card or whatever, right? You can use it as a guide. So those are 3 things that I do just to get ready before designing. And then relating to choosing typography and colors, right? It can be really hard to figure this out, right? When you're first starting, like it's not easy to say like, oh, this Poppins font is really good. Like you kind of need to like experiment and see what is good or not, right? So definitely look at existing designs. What I like to do is I'll go to Canva and they have a lot of flyer templates on there. And like this is good for both fonts and color palettes. You could literally just like copy paste it into your Figma design and just like with the color picker, you can like drag and drop into your color palette. And sometimes the typography is a bit weird, but they also have good fonts. So that's a good source of like typography and colors. Like you could also use Dribble too, though. Dribble sometimes is a lot of graphic designs. They're not so much flyers, but for example, this image right here is from Dribble. Like it's more like a logo, you know, like there's a lot of, there's like more variety on Dribble is what I'm trying to say. But no matter wherever you get it from, you could just copy an image and color pick it to get the colors. And maybe you could even use mob and application shots. I haven't done that, but really, you could just copy, like, you could take an image of an existing mobile screen and be like, oh, I like that color, right? And so these two images are from the Figma design. The bottom one, again, I found it from Dribble, and I thought, oh, I like these greens. So I copied it into Figma, I dragged and dropped into my color palette here. So I have like a primary green, the dark green. I have this lighter green, and then I have this really light green that I actually didn't end up using. And then I have like an off-white and a completely flat white. And in terms of the typography, I just kind of chose these mainly because like I know that they're already good. But again, like if you don't know like where to start, Canva is the way to go. But Poppins is a really popular one that I like to use for heading and subheadings. And Leto is a kind of common like body paragraph text or font, sorry. So this is what I went with. And now I'll go ahead and show you like the Figma design that I made for the to-do app, right? So here we have a splash screen. This is kind of where I like to start. I create a splash screen, maybe with some vectors. In this case, I went with vectors and just like a logo or the name of the app. And on the right side here, we have the dashboard. So again, like your user might come into your app and be like, okay, maybe they want to see their profile, notifications, that's at the top. They have settings there if they need it. And then some cards to show you the current to-do tasks for today. So we clearly have like a today section, some to-dos in there with, you know, little buttons to click and complete them. And then you might want to drag them into the completed section. So this is the design I went with, and there's some noticeable design principles that I mentioned before, right? Color and contrast. If you notice, I didn't use more than like one green. I think these are all the same green. And the background is an off-white. The cards are a white, so there's like a good color and contrast going on here. Typography, again, it's nice and formal, not too like professional, but it's like modern, right? That's what Poppin kind of gives you, Poppins. Consistency and white space. All these cards are like evenly spaced. There's not too much clutter in the actual cards. Each section is evenly spaced from each other, right? The icons are evenly spaced. So there's a lot of consistency here. White space. Again, simple over complex. This is a very simple design, and like I think this is enough, to be honest. Like less is more, like I said earlier. You don't want to over design. And then visual hierarchy, I kind of talked about that, right? Your user would go from top to bottom. They would see like, okay, they're today to-dos and completed. Like maybe at the end of the day, they would want to see how productive they were. So yeah, that's basically the design that I'll be trying to implement for next time. I might not implement like the actual functionality of the to-dos, but I'll for sure design the actual, I'll for sure implement the design that you see here, just to kind of reinforce the idea that like you can implement any design pretty much. And I read it here that you shouldn't feel like you won't be able to implement your designs, right? Like if you're designing, you think this design is so complex, like you shouldn't feel like that, because honestly, it's possible. It might take a little more time, but it's definitely possible with Flutter, or even like React.js and other frameworks that do similar things, right? So that's pretty much all I have. So I'll go ahead and open it to any questions before we close off here. I know I took a little longer than 30 minutes, but yeah, so any questions? Okay, I just saw the question. If it's open source. Yeah, it's open source. Sorry about that. But cool. I guess it doesn't look like too many people have questions. So I guess I'll go ahead and end it off here, right? So the second part will be not this coming Friday, right? Because it's spring break, but the Friday after that. I think it's the same day as the spring social, but it'll most likely take place at like 4 p.m., like right before it, so that those two things don't conflict, right? So yeah, I guess I'll close it off now. If y'all have any questions later on, though, feel free to message me on Discord. I'm always down to talk about UI design, Flutter mobile development stuff. So yeah, cool. Thanks for coming, y'all.